The most influential weapon in human history wasn't invented by a king, a general, or even a weapons engineer. It was created by accident. More than 1,000 years ago, a group of Taoist monks in China were searching for something completely different. They wanted immortality. For centuries, these alchemists believed the right combination of minerals could unlock eternal life. So they mixed strange ingredients, heated mysterious powders, and followed ancient recipes passed down through generations. Then one experiment went horribly wrong. Instead of creating an elixir of life, the mixture erupted into a violent explosion. According to early records, workshops caught fire, beards were singed, and whatever those monks had discovered, it definitely wasn't eternal life. They called it huayao, or fire medicine. A name that still carries the irony of its original purpose. Because that failed medicine would eventually become the foundation of every gun, every cannon, and every firearm ever built. Even after discovering gunpowder, nobody immediately thought of turning it into a weapon. So what changed? The mixture itself was surprisingly simple. Saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. When ignited, saltpeter rapidly released oxygen, causing the entire mixture to burn almost instantly. That sudden reaction created an enormous amount of expanding gas. And that expanding gas would become the driving force behind every gun ever invented. At first, though, it wasn't used for war at all. Gunpowder became entertainment. Fireworks illuminated festivals. Religious ceremonies filled the night sky with flashes of light and thunderous sounds. To ordinary people, it was something beautiful, not something to fear. Until military commanders started paying attention. They realized the same explosion lighting up celebrations could also terrify an enemy. So during the Song dynasty, Chinese engineers built something astonishingly simple. Take a bamboo tube, fill it with gunpowder, strap it to the end of a spear, light the fuse. The result was the fire lance, a weapon that blasted flames and burning fragments directly at anyone standing in front of it. It wasn't really a gun. It wasn't even very accurate. But for soldiers who had spent their entire lives fighting swords and spears, seeing someone breathe fire across a battlefield must have felt almost supernatural. And that psychological shock mattered just as much as the flames themselves. The fire lance proved one thing beyond any doubt. Gunpowder belonged on the battlefield. The only question now was, could it do more than throw fire? Because once engineers started asking that question, history changed forever. The answer turned out to be yes. Someone had a simple idea. Instead of filling the bamboo tube with only gunpowder, what if you packed something else inside? Small stones, metal pellets, even broken pieces of pottery. The moment the powder exploded, those objects shot forward with surprising force. It was a small change, but it completely changed the purpose of the weapon. The fire lance was no longer just throwing flames. It was launching projectiles. For the first time, the basic principle behind every firearm had appeared. There was only one problem. Bamboo wasn't strong enough. As engineers experimented with larger gunpowder charges, the tubes often split apart, or worse, exploded in the user's own hands. So they replaced bamboo with bronze. That single upgrade gave birth to something entirely new. The hand cannon. Now, instead of blasting fire and debris, the expanding gases from gunpowder could propel a single solid projectile farther, faster, and with far more force than ever before. By the 13th century, these primitive cannons had already become part of Chinese warfare. But what happened next is why you have guns today. Because the technology didn't stay in China. It traveled. When the Mongols invaded China, they encountered gunpowder weapons during brutal sieges. And like many great conquerors throughout history, they didn't just defeat their enemies. They learned from them. As the Mongol Empire expanded across Asia, it carried this remarkable invention westward. Not intentionally. Simply because soldiers, engineers, and craftsmen moved with the empire. In just a few generations, knowledge that had once existed inside Chinese workshops reached the Islamic world, and eventually Europe. And gunpowder wasn't traveling alone. Paper, printing, the magnetic compass. Some of history's most important inventions were following the same routes across Eurasia. But gunpowder would have the greatest impact of them all. When it finally reached Europe in the late 13th century, it entered a world dominated by castles, armored knights, and centuries-old military traditions. At first, European guns weren't particularly impressive. They were heavy, slow to reload, difficult to aim, and sometimes just as dangerous to the person firing them. But they possessed one terrifying advantage. They didn't care how much armor you were wearing. For centuries, heavily armored knights had ruled medieval battlefields. Suddenly, a relatively cheap weapon carried by an ordinary soldier could threaten warriors who had spent a lifetime training for combat. That changed everything. Even the strongest castle walls, once thought nearly impossible to break, began falling to cannon fire. Military engineers were forced to rethink centuries of defensive architecture. The age of the medieval fortress was slowly coming to an end. But guns still had one major weakness. Firing them was painfully awkward. And solving that problem would transform firearms from crude experiments into the dominant weapon of the battlefield. The biggest problem with early guns wasn't power. It was firing them. To shoot a hand cannon, a soldier had to hold the weapon with one hand while bringing a burning match to a tiny touch hole with the other. On a calm day, it was awkward. In the middle of a battlefield, it was a nightmare. Engineers needed a better solution. They found it in the matchlock. Instead of manually touching a flame to the gun, a simple trigger lowered a slow-burning cord onto the gunpowder automatically. It sounds like a small improvement, but it completely changed how firearms were used. For the first time, soldiers could actually focus on aiming instead of simply trying to make the weapon fire. As matchlocks spread across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, Japan, and eventually back into China itself, firearms stopped being rare battlefield curiosities. They became standard military equipment. But they still had one frustrating weakness. Every soldier had to carry a burning fuse. Rain could extinguish it. Wind could expose it. And at night, that glowing ember advertised your position long before the enemy could see your face. So once again, engineers went back to work. The answer arrived with the flintlock. Instead of relying on a burning cord, a piece of flint struck steel, creating sparks that ignited the gunpowder instantly. It was faster, more reliable, and worked in conditions that made earlier firearms almost useless. For nearly 200 years, flintlocks became the dominant firearm across much of the world, shaping conflicts from European wars to colonial expansion and the American Revolution. Then came one final improvement: the socket bayonet. Earlier bayonets plugged directly into the barrel, making the gun impossible to fire. The new design locked around the outside instead, allowing soldiers to shoot and fight with the same weapon. That single innovation made an entire class of soldiers obsolete. For centuries, musketeers had depended on pikemen to protect them during the long reload process. Now every musketeer carried a pike on the end of his own gun. The battlefield changed almost overnight. By the early 19th century, newer ignition systems would replace flintlocks, opening the door to repeating rifles and eventually the modern firearms we know today. But the most remarkable part of this story isn't how guns became more powerful. It's how they began. Nobody woke up one morning determined to invent the firearm. There was no master plan, no military project, no race to build the perfect weapon. Just a group of Taoist monks searching for eternal life. A failed experiment. A workshop filled with smoke. And a discovery that slowly passed from Chinese engineers to Mongol conquerors, to Ottoman armies, to European craftsmen, each generation solving one small problem at a time. History's most influential weapon wasn't created in a single brilliant moment. It evolved over centuries. And it all started because someone was trying to stop death, only to accidentally change the way humans would wage war forever.